And it will eventually be replaced by an organization by a different name called the
KGB.
The KGB, right. And the KGB stands for, well, I do. It stands for the Committee of State Security. Committee of State Security. So you have that. There were also purges in the early 1920s, and Getty makes a lot of this, though it's not of the same vicious nature at the end of the 1930s. Purge in Russian is the same word for cleansing. Like people who all of a sudden go on tea diets to cleanse their body, or whatever tea diets cleanse your body of. This notion of purging has that sense. In Russian, it's the same word that you use to separate in harvesting the wheat from the chaff. That kind of cleansing out. And so the party was always concerned about sort of freeloaders, and periodically it engaged in this sort of thing. Because it was such an influential position, the Communist Party members were never more than 9 or 10% of the population. Never. But they were very influential, very powerful. Your peers in the 60s and 50s and 70s, and when we lived there in the 80s, the ones that wanted to kind of climb the ladder, wanted to do all the things you want to do, get into the right schools and get a good job in this, and join the Communist Party. And the Communist Party was at least concerned about times when it could be people who were did not represent the party well, and periodically it would have that kind of operation of removing people from its roles, though not associated with carnage in the way in which the 1930s. More significant for our purposes are these two. There's a trial in 1928 called the Shakti trial. Shakti, which is actually a word that means mines. Mines. And it's, this is a real stunner, it's a mining area in the North Caucasus. I did the research, I know these things. The Shakti was a place where they were not meeting the targets they had wanted, and they attributed it to toward espionage by engineers who had been influenced by foreigners and were hostile to the Bolshevik cause. It was a public, and it sets the stage, the Shakti trials, for what unfolds in the 1930s, because there's a public trial at which people confess to things that they were likely not guilty of, and those people are themselves executed. They've also confessed to it. And the question of confession is really an interesting one that Conquest does go into in The Great Terror. And even though I think Conquest overstates the cause for the country as a whole, I think there's something very compelling about the way in which people confess to all sorts of things that couldn't have been true. Couldn't have been true. Sleep deprivation, the thought that people are being told that if they confess, their family will be saved, their family will be spared, and that sort of thing. The assurance that people who had previously been executed really hadn't been executed. It was all for show, and showing them pictures alleging they were still alive and living in a Girl Guide camp in the Caucasus. I mean, all sorts of things that came out of came out as to why people would confess to what they had done. And I'll talk about that a little bit. But this Shakti trial clearly sets the stage for this. Public trials, public confessions, public, and then, well, not public executions, but then executions that would come very, very quickly after that. The other example is Chayanov. I've referred to him before. He's the one who thought Lenin was wrong. And when we talk about a cultural revolution as part of the 1930s, the reality is that already in 1930, all of these kind of former people, profs who had been profs beforehand or were children of the elites, people who were involved in other professions, the medical professions, people who were involved in government service, in the military leadership. The military will survive till the end of the 1930s. All of these kind of people are eliminated. Factory owners, factory managers. They're eliminated, tried, sentenced into Siberia. In Chayanov's case, brought out again, and then tried again, and then shot. 37, right? Yeah, 37. They're gone. So there's already around that time, because for a Marxist state, they want to put Marxists, they want to put communists in their place. Now, for people who think that Stalin is insane, what they say is that Stalin had no need to do anything after 1930. He had no need to do anything after 1930 because he was unassailable. His power was so immense, so enormous, that, that nothing could come close to it. And the reality is, what is, there are clever people here. 50 years after 1878 is 1928. Oh, you guys are good. But 1928 is, 28 is the kind of coming out party for the kind of Stalin cult. Because around his 50th birthday, they begin to sort of wrap Stalin in, for the first time, in kind of Lenin's mantle. Whereas Lenin was not interested in that kind of adulation beforehand, it clearly is there with Stalin. I'll show you some of the kind of posters that emerge out of that. So if that's the case, the argument goes that after 1928, there is no threat to Stalin. For people who argue that there is, and I don't know if there's a way to do an essay on this, they look at something like the Ryutin affair. Ryutin, the top guy, was a member of the Communist Party and had supported the Bolsheviks as a member of the Communist Party, but most especially was a big fan of NEP. And because of NEP, he supported Bukharin, whose name I might have on here. I might have Bukharin there, Bukharin. And Bukharin was, of course, the architect of NEP. So Ryutin was someone who believed in a kind of moderate socialism. With the collapse of NEP, he suddenly found himself in opposition within his own party. And so what Ryutin does at that point is he's expelled from the party, because it's the same reason if you are a cabinet minister and speak against the cabinet. He's allowed to enter back into the party. And in 1932, before a party congress, he releases a document to Communist Party members that is clearly identified with Ryutin, in which he says that the Communist Party has gone berserk under Stalin, and that it must be reined in, 1932. And that what happens is that old Bolsheviks have to be reinstated, including Trotsky. It's the so-called Ryutin affair. In the literature, it might be referred to with a Y. It's all on how you translate one letter in Russian. He called Stalin a grave digger of the revolution. Was Ryutin a serious threat to Stalin in 1932? Are people in power threatened by people who called them grave diggers? Is there a way in which this represented a vulnerability to Stalin? If you're Robert Conquest, you'll think crazy notion after 1978-79. But it's what I have to tell you in my experience of the last 25 years of my life is that the Ryutin affair, which I didn't know about when I was your age, what I didn't know about, no one had really talked about it, increasingly the literature identifies it as a factor. The trouble is, it's hard to determine. This isn't the off-on switch where it's yes or no, right? So I always say it's a pregnancy test, is another. It's this or it's that. You know. You know. You know what I mean? You can't be sort of, it's hard to be half pregnant. But when it comes to a lot of what's studied within the discipline of history, what makes it so extraordinary is it's not like that. And it requires us to, in a way, assess, to ponder, think a little bit about it.